My dear friends, 25 years ago, on this same Sabbath in Jewish time, when the Torah portion was Noah, it was actually October 1991. I was not only Temple's new youth rabbi running our high school program, I succeeded a predecessor I still admire and respect so much, Rabbi Mark Belgrad, whose wife, Susan Glazer Belgrad, happens to be here tonight. I succeeded him as the regional rabbinic advisor to SOFTY, the Southern Federation of Temple Youth. 4 months into my job as assistant rabbi and regional rabbinic advisor, I boarded a bus with 25 Temple high school kids and headed to Shreveport, Louisiana for the fall youth conclave. I helped to plan. It's a schlep to Shreveport from the Temple parking lot, but I managed to fall asleep for a brief nap. When I awoke, crossing into Louisiana, David Duke signs were everywhere. It was Friday, October 18th, the day before Louisiana's open primary system called the Jungle Primary. Candidates of any and all parties are listed on the ballot. Voters don't have to limit themselves to the candidates of any party. Unless one candidate takes 50% or more of the vote in the first round, there's a runoff held. So I had been so immersed in my new move to Memphis and trying to rebuild Temple's high school, I was oblivious to what was going on in Louisiana. On the very weekend, I brought our youth to Shreveport. And to make matters worse, we chaperones were lodged at the Sheridan Hotel, unlike Jill and the Softyites. And the Sheridan turned out to be the headquarters for the David Duke campaign. Incumbent Governor Buddy Roemer, Ed Edwards, State Representative David Duke, Congressman Holloway, and others were running in the next day primary during our conclave. Roemer was wounded by his mistakes as governor, while Edwards and Duke each had a passionate group of supporters. Only in recent days have I felt now as I did then. At the close of that Friday night service in Shreveport, Shabbat Noah, this Shabbat, I was invited to come up to the pulpit with faith leaders from that Louisiana parish. Priests, ministers, the Rabbi Emeritus of B'nai Zion, David Lefkowitz. Each of us offered our own prayer that no matter what happened on Saturday, we would somehow survive the vile and racist comments of David Duke voters were overlooking. And when Shabbat ended and the election results came in, David Duke not only won Shreveport, he won the most parishes of all the gubernatorial candidates in that October 19th, 91 election. 31. Edwards won 26. The incumbent governor, Roemer, only won 7. So the top two vote-getters, Duke and Edwards, were headed to a November runoff election for Louisiana governor. And as some of you are old enough to remember this, 25 years ago, faced with the choice of David Duke, many Louisians who were otherwise critical of Edwards now looked at him as the alternative, including Governor Roemer, whose whole campaign was anything but Edwards. But he ended up endorsing Edwards rather than Duke, and that runoff campaign was widely seen as one of the dirtiest and most negative campaigns in the history of our country. Edwards and his supporters seized on Duke's record as a white supremacist, statements about minorities, including Jews. Duke responded by claiming to be a Christian who has renounced racism and anti-Semitism after his born-again conversion. Nearly the entire Republican leadership rejected Duke's candidacy. Just one quote from President George H.W. Bush in his news conference. I quote, "When someone has a long record, an ugly record of racism and bigotry, that record simply cannot be erased by the glib rhetoric of a political campaign. So I believe David Duke is an insincere charlatan. I believe he should be rejected for what he is and what he stands for." In this jungle primary, Duke only lost by 24,000 votes out of 1.5 million. And then Edwards won the governorship. Duke supporters blame the media, Jews, and others for his defeat. But Louisiana went on. The state survived that bitter election. And like this week's Torah portion, Noah, it even survived a flood decades later. We now know as Hurricane Katrina. This past Wednesday night, as the Cubs, to the chagrin of Cleveland Indians fans, won Game 7 of the World Series, David Duke, 25 years later, won enough support in the Louisiana State Senate race to make Wednesday's televised debate. What did he say when asked about his anti-Semitic record? He said, and I quote, "I don't hate all the Jews." In response to a question about his hateful comment about CNN Jews on his website, David Duke replied 72 hours ago, not 25 years ago, and I quote, "There is a problem in America with a very strong, powerful, tribal group that dominates our media and dominates our international banking." 25 years ago, it made sense to me that white nationalists who despise immigrants supported David Duke. The question I've been pondering since the black church in Mississippi was set on fire, the question I've been asking myself since Duke and the KKK newspaper endorsed one of Tuesday's presidential candidates is why? Don't get me wrong. I'm aware that many Americans and Jews will be voting for Mr. Trump rather than Secretary Clinton. We're the only synagogue in America with two likely U.S. congressmen who are polar opposites on the political spectrum, Congressman Cohn and candidate Kustoff. But the question remains, why, while the World Series was going on and I was watching and trying to get to hear what Duke was saying at the same time, why do followers of a white nationalist who speak of a white genocide resonate so strongly with one candidate and want to lock up the other? And it's not a question of whether a candidate disavows support from neo-Nazi and white nationalist groups. Rather, the question is why David Duke himself is so drawn to one candidate and not another, and why is Duke still blaming the Jews? The name of this week's Torah portion, the same one I was kept awake by the victory party at Duke headquarters at the Sheraton 25 years ago tomorrow night, is the story of Noah. And Noah is a morality tale. You'll recall that last week in Genesis, we read that God called the creation of man and woman very good. Now, only a few generations after Adam and Eve, things have gotten out of hand. Humanity has proven unable to live with one another. There was chaos and violence. And so, as we know, God decided to wipe out humanity with a massive flood and start all over with Noah, an Ish Tzaddik, a righteous man, and his family. And at the end of the flood, after everything is destroyed except for those in the ark, God places the first rainbow in the sky as a symbol that never again will God destroy us unless we destroy ourselves and the earth along with us. We can all understand why the Jewish religion did not begin with Adam and Eve, even though they are the first people mentioned in Scripture. The Torah wanted to make the point that Adam and Eve had no religion. Adam and Eve had no race, no creed. That way, no one could say, my race or my religion is better than your race or religion. Instead, Adam, a name which means earth, was created from all different colors of earth, from all ends of the world. Adam and Eve represent the universal man and woman, not the mother and father of the Jewish people. But what about Noah? Why wasn't our religion named after Noah? Why do we have to wait for Abraham? After all, Noah is the only person called a righteous man. Not even Moses was called a righteous man. Noah was a righteous man, but with a big flaw. Nowhere, the rabbis point out, does Noah show a feeling of sadness and empathy that an entire generation was to be lost and others destroyed. It's that fatal flaw, the early rabbis said, which explains why he did not become the father of a new religion, a new faith, a new community. It took Abraham, who would defend innocent people in Sodom and Gomorrah and talk God out of acting unjustly. It took Abraham, who, while recovering from surgery, kept his tent open to welcome strangers and anyone who needed hospitality. It took people with the quality Noah lacked, compassion, the rabbis say. It took Abraham and Sarah to become the father and mother of the Jewish faith. Noah lacked compassion, and because he lacked compassion, he forfeited that far greater place in history that might have been accorded him. 25 years ago, what got me through the Louisiana election I didn't vote in was the same three-legged stool I believe every person needs for optimal well-being. One is what I call the communal leg, our families, our temple family, this compassionate and all-embracing community, your circle of friends, your community. The second leg is the spiritual dimension, the faith idea inherent in the synagogue, that somehow things are going to be all right in this world, and things are going to be all right when we leave this world. The third leg is the emotional, psychological, and it's that leg, I believe, we need to shore up after next Tuesday. Not the political, but the psychological trauma, the anxiety many people are unaware of. And I don't just mean the trauma of David Duke and his followers again 25 years after. What I mean is what I read in the newsletter to therapists, psychologists, and psychiatrists, none of which I am, but all of whom I admire. I've been reading of how female patients in recent months have been re-experiencing traumas they thought had finally been put behind them. I'm not talking about one or two, but in the national newsletter to psychologists of all stripes, sexual assault victims who learn through therapy how to integrate that trauma into their lives but not to be defined by it. And the regression taking place for more than a few women because of this election is related to the message that you can have your way with a woman and get away with it if you're powerful enough. So just accept that fact and live with it. Whether or not you despise Hillary Clinton or Donald Trump, we cannot let this or any election trigger psychological regression inside a person or in relation to others. We must stop our country, no matter what happens on Tuesday, from turning Noah-like instead of Abrahamic. And what does that look like? It looks like, in terms of Noah-like, a society lacking in compassion, fearing the outsider, looking out for oneself more than ever instead of looking out for others. And it is those conditions and that context, forget about the candidates, it's those conditions and that context which allowed the David Dukes and the burning of black churches in Mississippi to happen. Now, I confess, the smell of bigotry nauseates me. And I hope it nauseates you too, no matter what your politics. It nauseates Republicans, it nauseates Democrats. My teacher, Elie Wiesel, once said that silence never encourages the tormented, only the tormentor. So I pray that Republicans, Democrats, and independents will stop condoning the xenophobia, racism, anti-Semitism while everybody was watching the World Series, all the other isms which lead to a compassionless Noah instead of a relational, affirming, universal, Abrahamic faith. May the very best in us prevail. Not just next Tuesday, but the day after and the months after. As Jews, as children of Adam and Abraham, and as citizens of the greatest country the world has ever known. Amen.